little late. Welcome to the Boston City Council chamber for our hearing on docket number 0131, order for a hearing regarding the use of public ways. My name is Michelle Wu, and I'm chair of the Committee on Planning, Development, and Transportation. I'm joined by my colleagues, the lead sponsor, Councillor Zakem, as well as our colleague, Councillor Ed Flynn. I want to remind everyone that this public hearing is being recorded and broadcast live on channels Comcast 8, RCN 82, and Verizon 1964, as well as streaming on the City of Boston website. So if you could please silence your cell phones and other devices, we will make sure to move right along. Today, we're welcoming a panel that will include our Chief of Environment, Energy, and Open Space, Director of Tourism, Sports, and Entertainment, as well as our Director of Traffic Engineering. These gentlemen have very graciously allowed for or agreed that we will take a few minutes of public testimony before we get to them, because members of the public have been waiting for a long time. So I'll give my colleagues a chance to give an opening statement, then we'll take up to 3 members of the public who wish to speak, and then hand it over to our panel. Councilor Zakem.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I also want to thank everyone for their patience, so I'll be brief in my opening remarks and just sort of lay the groundwork for why we did call for this hearing. It's over the last 5+ years that I've been privileged to represent, among other areas, the Back Bay, District 8. There's been a proliferation of road races, walks, parades, some political in nature, which obviously no one could have predicted particularly after 2016, and certainly that's the kind of expression we want to support. But there are dozens every year, and what I would like to find out really from this panel, and as we continue into this discussion, what the guidelines are, the framework is for approving particularly new events in the neighborhood. Obviously, the Walk for Hunger, the Boston Marathon, long-standing, beloved institutions, not just around the city of Boston, but in our community. But what the process is, who the final decision maker is, and what can be done to mitigate this, and if there are significant discussions on how we can encourage other events, either new or even existing ones that may be a good fit for other neighborhoods, particularly where it requires street closures, and we'll get more into the details a little bit later, but to mitigate some of the negative impacts of what are often very popular and positive events. And that's what we're looking to do here, is to figure out what the process is, if there's a way we can change it from a policy standpoint, if it requires changes in legislation, and also making sure that residents in our communities are notified. Not just in District 8, but across the city, when there are going to be road closures and what those entail. And also the communication we can have with transportation and the police department, and maybe a common sense approach to some of these road closures, and making sure we've had a lot of success, first with Commissioner Evans, and I hope to continue that with Commissioner Gross, on making sure that people on Marathon Monday, for example, are able to get in and out of their homes, sort of usually on the side of Com Ave that backs up to Newberry Street. We've had huge progress over the last few years on that, just making sure that the police officers on details there have the discretion to say, if someone says, I'm living right there, can I come in or come out, to do that in a way that's safe. And I think there's definitely a common sense solution to this issue that we can all undertake, and I will end it there and save the rest of this for questions. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Zakem. Councillor Flynn.
Thank you, Councillor Wu, and to Councillor Zakem as well. And my only comment I would like to make is I just want to thank the panelists for being here, but more importantly for your many years of experience and leadership in helping our city, put a great light on the city through the tourism, through the parks, through transportation. I think you guys work great as a team, and you work great with the neighborhoods, and there's a lot of events happening in our city, but I think it's because of you and your staff that Boston is doing so well. But it takes a team effort, and it's also working closely with the neighborhoods, and I think your staff have been doing that, and just want to say thank you for many years of helping the residents of Boston. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Flynn. So now we'll turn to public testimony. There's one individual signed up right now, Elliot Laffer. If you could please come down, Mr. Laffer. And again, I'll take up to 2 more individuals if anyone else wishes to speak in this first time chunk. And of course, after the panel, we'll open it up for public testimony at the end as well. Elliot.
Madam Chair, councilors, thank you. My name is Elliot Laffer. I'm with the Neighborhood Association of the Back Bay, and I've lived on Commonwealth Avenue now for almost 45 years, which is amazing when you're 12 years old. I've had the opportunity to see what a wonderful street it is in the springtime and the summer and the fall, and understand why people would want to have their walks, races, and other events there. I suppose I would want to have them there too if I were coming from outside. And any one of these is wonderful, and some of them we particularly celebrate. You didn't even mention that we seem to have baseball teams and football teams that have parades by us. I haven't heard anybody complain about those yet. But when you have them, what seems like almost every weekend, and for people who need their weekends to do a lot of errands that they can't do during the week, it can be very challenging. I can remember when I was working once, coming home the evening when there was one of these 5 o'clock road races, and having to sit a block from my house for an hour waiting for the street to clear. I didn't even know it was coming, and I'm usually fairly informed about this. So notice is an issue, the ability to get in and out of your homes and to get across the neighborhood. These events really should be distributed around the city. While we're a beautiful neighborhood, we're not the only beautiful neighborhood in the city. I suspect we're not the only neighborhood that has long streets, and that these events can bring their benefits and also whatever non-benefits they have to other neighborhoods as well. We have another issue that people have raised about the events that seems to be proliferating, and that's that they seem to be drawing helicopters. And the noise from the helicopters is, again, if it was there for 2 minutes, you wouldn't notice it. When they're there for hours, as seems to happen, then it starts to be very annoying. So it's a quality of life issue. There are certainly bigger quality of life issues in the city and in our neighborhood, but it's an important one, and we appreciate your taking the time to dig into this and see if we can distribute the pluses and minuses around the city a little better. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Would anyone else like to speak at this time? Great, then thank you. We'll hand it over to our panelists and then take question and answers from colleagues.
Great. Councilors, thank you so much for the opportunity to testify today. My position was created in 2014 to reflect Mayor Walsh's promise to separate the city's tourism strategies from its arts and culture strategy so each can focus on their respective missions. My office falls under the Economic Development Department, which is headed by John Barros. My role is to work to bring major athletic events and cultural events, conventions and conferences to Boston and aggressively market the city nationally and internationally. My mission is to attract new energy and investment into the city of Boston and invite the world to experience our city. As director of the Mayor's Office of Tourism, Sports, and Entertainment, I have the privilege of serving as the chair of the Public Event Committee. Anyone hosting an event on public property or an outdoor private property needs to apply for permits through the Public Event Committee. Whether the event is free or ticketed, open to the public, or invitation only, it doesn't matter. It is still necessary to apply. Public events include road races, block parties, festivals, and parades. In 2018, the Public Event Committee oversaw the permitting of 568 public events in the city of Boston. Now, that's throughout the entire city. In 2017, the Public Event Committee oversaw the permitting of 545 public events throughout the city of Boston. The mission of my office is to advance tourism in Boston and promote participation in both public celebrations from Boston residents and visitors to our city. We support the tourism industry in Boston by producing events, supporting TV, film, and production, and marketing the city to conventions and visitors, and of course, guide event planners throughout the permitting process. Depending upon the type of event, an event planner may need to get permits from several departments throughout the city. My office's job is to help event planners navigate the various permitting processes at the city. We facilitate meetings and provide guidance. We do not issue public event permits. Instead, we use our public event application form to walk event planners through the process of getting the various permits they needed to host their specific event. Since we take our role as facilitator and guide so seriously, we have a thorough online application form, which event planners are advised to fill out well in advance of the event. Once we receive an application, we set up a meeting with the Public Event Committee to our meetings. I am continually impressed by the professionalism and hard work of the representatives of the Public Event Committee. They ensure that all of the events take place in the city of Boston. And the Public Event Committee is comprised of representatives from a dozen relevant offices throughout the city. Now, these are the folks who come to our weekly event committee meetings: Boston Police Department, Boston Fire Department for Fire Prevention, the Transportation Department, Inspectional Services, ISD, Public Works Department, Parks and Recreation Department, Property Management for anything that happens in City Hall Plaza, EMS, Department of Economic Development, which is if they're having any food trucks, and the also Licensing Board and Liquor Commission it's for the entertainment and licensing. We also consult with the Department of Neighborhood Services on all our events, and we also have representation from the MBTA and the Massachusetts Department of Conservation and Recreation. I look forward to answering any of your questions to the council at this time or after Chris would speak.
Thank you. Thank you, Director Brissett. Just very briefly, Madam Chair, Councilor Flynn, Councilor Zachem, thank you very much for the opportunity to testify. I think it's important to give you a little context of just how busy our city is, and in the scope and the breadth of the Boston Parks and Recreation Department, you get some sense of what our residents are participating in on a daily basis. As Chief of Environment, Energy, and Open Space, I have the privilege of also serving as the Commissioner of Boston Parks and Recreation. And in calendar year 2018 alone, calendar year, not fiscal year, 4,084 permits were issued by Boston Parks. Of those, 1,351 were for adult athletics, 991 were for youth athletics, 194 were for weddings, and 17 were closings related to construction and renovations of our parks. It's important to note that those numbers, so 4,084 permits, does not reflect actual instances of an event. So for instance, a Little League could pull one permit but have an entire season of events associated with them. At this point, just very briefly, I'd be remiss if I didn't acknowledge the real hardworking folks at the permitting division led by Paul McCaffrey at Boston Parks and Recreation Department. And of course, they work in concert with the Special Events Department, as Director Brissett mentioned. Of course, there's a universe of passive and active recreation that also goes on well beyond just the permit holders. Our parks are intentionally designed to maximize recreational opportunities for our residents, especially youth. This is central to our mission. And in recent years, through Mayor Walsh's Parks First initiative, with support from the Boston City Council, the department has put a special emphasis on inclusive design. We want to ensure that our open spaces are accessible to all regardless of ability, and I think special events in our city have been making that same commitment. So it is within this context of activity that Boston Parks is often host for the setup and finishing of events that involve the closing or partial closure of public ways. The department never closes a public way for an event. That approval is only granted through the Special Events Committee process that my colleague, Director Brissett, described. As the Director emphasized, public safety is paramount in these discussions. Boston's public safety personnel are second to none, and I am continually impressed by the professionalism of Boston Fire, Boston Police, and Boston EMS, as well as the other committee members and their commitment to public safety, the Boston Transportation Department, the Inspectional Service Department, Public Works, DCR, and many others. Boston Parks participates on Special Events Committee on a weekly basis to make sure that there's as much coordination as possible with these other departments. I am happy to answer your questions, as well as we're joined by our hardworking colleague, the Chief Engineer for the Boston Transportation Department, Eddie Hesford.
I'd just add that, the Transportation Department role is formulating the traffic management plans and the operations plans for a safe event in coordination with Boston Police, Boston Fire, EMS, et cetera. So we have a nice working committee in the special events. My engineer in charge of that is Timothy Burdine, who does a great job in pulling that all together on the transportation side. Certainly, there's a lot of thought that puts in with this, the whole team putting together that plan relative to, roadway detours, impacts, et cetera, that, potentially could come about, and we want to keep the city open and viable. I mean, that's our mission within the transportation realm, and certainly we strive to do that. So I'm glad to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you very much to all three of you. I know how much is on your plates, as our offices are always reaching out to you on a really wide variety of issues. So appreciate you making time today. Councilor Zakem.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, gentlemen, for your comments. I have several questions relating to the approval process. So it sounds, and maybe this probably goes best to you, Ken, I'm not sure. Who decides now? Is it the Special Event Committee takes a vote and says, we should allow this to move forward, whether it's a race, whether it's a parade, whatever it is? Is that typically how it happens?
Yeah, let me answer some of the questions you have. So anyone hosting an event has to go on the online portal and actually apply for the event, whether the event is free or ticketed or open to the public. I mentioned public events include road races, block parties. They can have entertainment, food, and beverages. When someone submits an application, the information about their event must include a copy of their rental agreement if the event is being held on public property, a copy of the site plan for their event. This includes a map of the event area, streets, or roads that would be affected and the size of the dimensions of any structure they will be building. Many events taking place in the city also require the applicant to insure their event as well as co-insure the city of Boston. After they apply online, my office, Joyce Judge, who's sitting right over here in the galley over here, will call and discuss the event with the applicant. She will then have the applicant come into the Special Events Committee with their site plan, and I have some examples of that right with their site plan, and all the information they have for the event, where they're reaching out, who they're reaching out to do. We sit with all the different departments, and then again, they would go around and everyone would introduce themselves to each other as what department they're representing. Then the applicant would go through the actual event. At that time, anyone from the city there will be signing off on what permits they will need, whether it's building, stage, generator permits and fire, ISD, et cetera, et cetera. Once that all happens, they have to bring the permit and have it signed off by the district captain in each neighborhood. And then they have to go through the permitting process of what permits they actually need. Once they get all those permits from all the different agencies in the city, they will end up in licensing upstairs on the 8th floor, and they will either enter a special event application or an entertainment license.
So for a road race, they go to the licensing board.
So for a road race, the first thing they have to do for a road race, they have to send a letter well in advance to Commissioner Fiandaca. She will then look at the letter and work with Tim Burdine, and they will either accept it or deny that road race, depending upon what it is. They would come to our meeting, and when they come to a meeting, we have an Excel spreadsheet of all events that are happening in the city, whether it's the Red Sox, the Celtics, the Bruins, any concerts at the Garden, any concerts at Fenway, all parks events, and everything that we do. So we can go through that list, and if they're gonna have a road race, let's say, for instance, September 15th, last year we put in September 15th that we weren't accepting any more applications for any events in the city because there was already too much going on. So we monitor that, and we figure out whether or not that race could be feasible. Since 2014, we have not added any new additional road races on Conmap, with the exception of a few one-off events that have come. One I consider the Realtor Run that we did last year, and any walks or any celebrations. And I know that the gentleman was talking about the helicopters, and I can address that. The helicopters were from the rallies and the marches that would come through. They wouldn't usually, or if it was the 10K marathon or the BAA, that's where the helicopters would come through. Once they get that application, they would then come to the Special Events Committee, and we work with traffic management, with transportation, with police, with EMS, with fire, to make sure that the event can happen in a certain street or section of the city, or if it could be, we'd like to move it to other areas in the city. We don't like to add, or we don't like to put any more events, any more road races or anything on Conmap.
So it sounds like when it comes down to it, it's either Commissioner Fiandaca and or BPD who have the final word on a road race? It could be a whole
slew of us. It all depends upon if they want to do a race on June 1st, let's say, and there are already too many events in the city, we couldn't do it.
Just to clarify one thing, but when the request comes in for a road race. Basically, that is then forwarded to the Special Events Committee. There's no decision made at that time. It needs to be fully vented through all the different agencies and public safety about the viability of that application before the commissioner would sign off on something like that.
Is there a stage in this application for a new event where, whether it's the Special Events Committee or anyone involved says, you should go meet with the relevant civic association? We have the Neighborhood Association of Back Bay is represented here. You know, I think the closure list that BTD puts out is very good. It's very useful. One of my concerns, though, is that that's often the first information that I get as a district city councilor, and I think probably that many of our neighbors get about the event. It's a great service, and you know, to the extent that maybe we could incorporate that with ONS, because they do put out their weekly updates by neighborhood, I think that would help address some of the notice issues, but not fully. I do think, you know, one of the strengths of this city, and one of the reasons I think our neighborhoods are so vibrant and strong, has been the engagement of civic associations and neighborhood associations, block organizations, you know, whatever they choose to style themselves in this process. And I think at least a notification early on, perhaps when they come to the Special Events Committee for the first time, would be useful. And I would ask that you consider implementing that.
Yeah.
Thank you. Another question, something I've raised in the past, have there been any efforts or suggestions with events that are not quite as iconic as the marathon, as the Walk for Hunger, that are not geographically tied, to explore other venues? I think of what we had I think it was last year. We had the JP Morgan Corporate Challenge and the BAA 10K. Very similar route, if not identical, within a couple days of each other in June. Those are both incredibly well-attended 10Ks. You know, a lot of people getting their exercise in, raising money for good causes, but that really do strangle the neighborhood. You know, Corporate Challenge sounds to me something that might make sense in a financial district, in the seaport, you know, areas that are vibrant, that are accessible. There's a lot of space, and that on the weekends, there's not a lot going on over there. So what is the approach to something like that? Has that been broached with some of these organizers, and how would we move forward with that?
Yeah, we have, we've moved several races to different parts of the city. East Boston, for example. We've moved a lot of races over to South Boston, where we use State Boulevard, which is state, and that's why we have Department of Conservation and Recreation come in and help us, because they're the ones who will say whether or not a race could be had. We've moved races over to Franklin Park, and there's also a 5K route that we looked at over in East Boston that we're trying to navigate all of our 5K folks to go over. There's been no new events over there, over in the ComAv area. Everything that has been there for 10, 15 years. They've been doing these races.
Yeah, so I would say that there's a strong interest on the part of the participants of the Special Events Committee to move it to other geographic areas of the city, and frankly, working with some of our regional partners to really explore opportunities beyond city limits as well. Like, we want to receive the economic co-benefits of these events. However, we do realize that some of the routes are big enough that they can be a burden on city residents. So the places within the city that we've been promoting as special event locations are places like Millennium Park in West Roxbury, the 5K route, which involves the East Boston Greenway that Director Brissett mentioned, and then any opportunities along the coast of Dorchester and South Boston as well. I will say, and this will come as no surprise, that there is a strong desire, urge for new events coming to the city to really participate in that iconic geography and the architecture of the Back Bay. That doesn't mean that we should necessarily accommodate them.
No, I appreciate that, and I appreciate hearing about the efforts to distribute these a little more. I would say, and I've gotten, you know, given the timing of the day, not as many folks could come in person, but I have a stack of written testimony. Many of them have suggested the Esplanade. I know that's state property, but not disruptive to traffic, not disruptive to access to the neighborhood. I think you just mentioned Day Boulevard. Similarly, another area to look at, not just for these new applicants, but for folks that have been in the neighborhood using it for a while. I will say, and this certainly isn't on any of you three, I am disappointed that the police department is not here to talk about this. I think both from a decision-making standpoint, it's important to have them at the table, but also one of the easiest ways to mitigate negative impacts of this is for the police officers who are enforcing the road closures to have some discretion from command staff to obviously, consistent with public safety, if there's a break, for a while in the runners, maybe the fastest folks, they got there, and then where I would be in the middle or the back of the pack, there's a bit of a gap.
Yep.
And I see that sometimes, and there's sometimes discretion exercise, but that needs to come from the top. I think people want to make sure that they're doing what they're supposed to do and doing their jobs. So I would hope that whether it's a district captain or it's deputy superintendent in planning or it's the commissioner, whomever it is, does participate in this, because I think that alone could go a long way towards mitigating many of these impacts. It doesn't mitigate the noise and the helicopters, and I've had I don't know how many discussions with the FAA, with the state over the years about helicopters, in Fenway, Back Bay, Beacon Hill. That's something that may be beyond us as a city right now. But there are things that we can do with the existing things, and we have had success around the marathon, which is great. And I think part of that success of that is because it's such a well-known event that we can plan for it pretty successfully. And I'd like to see that, for many of these existing races that do require significant closures. And listen, a 5K that's happening from 7:30 a.m. to 9 a.m. or whatever it is, on a Sunday, has a significantly different and lesser impact than the J.P. Morgan Corporate Challenge, which is usually, I believe, in the evening. It's a 10K, that sort of thing. So a big goal of this hearing is to, one, make sure that we're thinking about these things, but also almost every single one of these emails I've received talk about in glowing terms how people love the vibrancy in the neighborhood. They want to support these causes, but that there are things we can tweak to make it better. And the notice goes a long way to that. So it's encouraging to hear your willingness to work on that.
Yeah, I would also say I think your point is well met, Councilor. While there's strong coordination around the event logistics themselves and what's going to make for a successful event, we could certainly engage with BPD and the BFS at PPD to try to see if we can apply that same level of organization that we do around the marathon planning to some of these smaller events to make it easier on the burden on the neighborhood.
And I do think, this will be the last time I say it, I do think if whomever is in charge, whether it's the district commander at D4 in this case or elsewhere, to give the word to the men and women of the Boston Police Department who are out there protecting these events and manning the traffic barriers, say, listen, use your judgment if someone lives right there. And I personally have had, some mixed success over the years on that front. So I do want to say that I think goes a long way towards resolving a lot of these concerns. I think that's probably it from my questions right now. I do think I do appreciate this. I appreciate your attention to this and willingness to work with us. And as I said from the beginning, ideally, some of these minor policy changes can be put in place on your side of things, and that there won't be a legislative process. We don't need to do this, but getting those guidelines out there, bringing neighborhood associations, perhaps the district city councilors in at some level. I know 4,084 permits a year. We don't need to be part of every one of those. But certainly, I appreciate your attention to this. I do appreciate it. It's good to see the data, and I also want to thank my staff who poured over years of this data that was provided to put this in a readable form for me to be informed about this. I know there's a lot there, but like I said from the beginning, this is something that I think some common sense fixes can really address and improve quality of life in the neighborhood.
I just wanted to mention one thing. One of the things that we've, through some of the conference calls we've been into, we're investing in a destination market event impact calculator, which is going to be basically give us the overall economic impact of some of these events.
I want to recognize that Councillor Sabi George has joined us as well. Would you like to ask a question? Okay, so I'll have a few questions that build on what Councillor Zachem was saying. So first is, would it be possible just to provide, I don't know if it's written down in one place, but sort of a set of steps for what the different permits or, where people have to do it, where do they send the letters to, so that for each of the different types of events, just so we know what the difference is between road race, block party, et cetera.
If you go on the Tourism Sports Entertainment website, there'll be a section called How To, and it will be how to fill out a public event application, and it will bring you through the 3 different steps. It will tell you the different departments. I had mentioned police, fire, ISD, et cetera. It will give you an idea of what permits you might need, so when you're coming into the Special Events Committee, you'll be able to pull that up, and it's all online.
Okay, great. Is there just a one-pager somewhere, or is it kind of you have to click through step by step, or does it live in, is there a flyer?
It lives right on the site.
Okay.
But we'll be happy to provide it
Yes.
as well.
Okay, yeah, anything you
Sorry,
have would be great. I
Yeah.
think as we're trying to think about this, even the distinction between different
Mm-hmm.
types of public events is helpful. And then, so is there any consideration now of kind of what is a reasonable number or frequency of events per geography, per neighborhood, or kind of per block?
We took the whole city and we figured out how many events were in each neighborhood. We figured out how many events and how many street closures were in each neighborhood. Council Zacham's district is a popular district. We try and steer new events away from this district now and going into the different other neighborhoods of the city: Roxbury, Hyde Park, West Roxbury, Roslindale, South Boston. Sometimes in the Seaport we do some stuff, but we want to separate as much as we can out of his district.
So just taking Councilor Zacham's district, or even, Com Ave or Back Bay as kind of the one end of the spectrum, how often is it? Is it every single weekend day, or what's the kind of frequency?
We comprise of a list of all the events from 2017 to 2018 of his district. We can get you that exactly what was there and what was not. We did include some events in the south end, but they're in there. But we can get that to you.
Okay.
But it's most weekends. It's most weekends, whether
Running
it's a
from what month to
road
what
race
month?
or,
The marathon starts at the
April through
marathon.
October.
And then it
April
goes
through October.
October.
Okay.
There's some stuff in November, but not a lot.
And during that kind of April through October window, is it Saturday and Sunday, or do you try to reserve, some block of time, or?
Yeah, we'll share the calendar with you. The difference is that a lot of the events are impactful in different ways.
Yeah.
So the scope really changes with the type of event. For major events that use the Com Ave route, Director, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think there's probably only 6 or 7 or so of those that really close down and really impact someone like getting out of their driveway or accessing their car.
Okay.
However, between that and the block parties and the additionality of the events that happen on the common, as well as any filming or construction that's happening in the neighborhood, it can get very busy. What I would also add is in the Back Bay, you also have the addition of Copley Square. So, if there's a major event happening at Copley Square, there could be a partial closure of Dartmouth, or just an impact with loading in or loading out of Copley Square as well.
Okay.
So we took a tally, just Council,
Yeah.
just give you an example. In 2017, which is right after we talked about the election there, the Council Zacham's district had 16 walks and then we had there was 7 parades, but out of the 7 parades, those were more of the protest parades, and that decreased in 2018.
Got it. Okay. And so the way that it works now, is it just first come, first serve for a particular time and location? So for example, if there's a walk that's been kind of going a couple years now and someone else wants to do something, do you kind of reevaluate every year, or what's the scheduling priority?
For instance, if the BAA, the marathon, it's usually that's
Yeah, marathon aside.
all the same time. But we work with, if all the events come in, we can work with whoever it is. Usually it is a first come, first served basis. It also depends on where the event is going to be.
Okay.
and how many events are in the city. We have to take into consideration what's going on at Fenway Park.
Sure.
I just want to add on to
Also
what the
Mr.
director is saying. There's always a deference to the existing events.
Right.
Yeah.
So basically, and how far out are you scheduling? Or do you issue permits?
About a
or
year.
A year, okay. So basically, if there's more interest in adding events, you kind of have to, whoever kind of lays claim in a year before, it essentially gets a right of first refusal or something like that, and then others will get recommended to a different location or a different date, or do you ever kind of flat out reject any events?
We try not to reject anything. We try and make it so if it can't happen here, it can happen over here. And we did a lot of that did that with a lot of groups from last year.
So two new things that we've been working in partnership with the Tourism, Sports, and Entertainment Department with is creating a 5K route within the common itself
Yep.
and also within Franklin Park to try to get out of the business of closing roads because it's so impactful. That's been successful. However, that's now starting to run into the traditional yearly events that we have at both those parks. And so we're really at capacity at those.
Yeah, and this is tangential and probably a topic for a different day, but it feels like there's going to be no stoppage of more interest in hosting events, and there will be more and more, which is a good thing for our city, that people are interested in bringing people together and creating these, social and economic benefits. But that if every weekend in the ideal location, the ideal time is claimed by someone else who's been there before, there just seems to be something maybe inequitable about that, and whether it's some feedback from the public of, we're these good hosts for that neighborhood, and should that mean that next year, because there is such a high demand for people wanting to do something, if they weren't responsible actors, maybe they shouldn't, take a year off and see what happens, or different, they fall down in the priority that's given, and or even, assuming that everyone handles the neighborhood interaction really well and that there's no complaints. Even just the idea that there should be some feedback from the community on how they want their kind of the mitigation that they have to deal with, the impacts that they have to deal with, should that go to this or that cause that they care about. Maybe there's a local organization that wants to do a walk that they would much rather, be inconvenienced for than some national organization that's coming in again and again and again. So I don't know if there's room for that conversation somewhere, but I think Back Bay certainly should be at the table when it comes to talking about that, since they are the epicenter of these types of events. But thinking through citywide, if there's a policy around how the reevaluation happens year after year, understanding that the organizations need stability to continue growing their events too. So you're in a tough spot, I know, but just throwing that out there.
I think your point is well met, and we certainly learned a lot from Councilor Zacum's community and neighborhood in the process of dealing with the Freedom Rally on Boston Common recently. And certainly, no event should get to that point before the city takes action. So I think the more we can incorporate that thoughtfulness in our approach to scheduling these events, we'd benefit from that.
Thank you. Councilor Sabi George, anything add at this point?
Okay, thank
Councilor Zacum, any other questions?
No, thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, gentlemen. I appreciate your willingness to listen. I think to hear from the residents, many of the folks that I represent, I feel encouraged by this, especially as we are getting into the spring season. So I do just want to reiterate that two of the most crucial action items that can be implemented, maybe not overnight, but pretty close, is trying to incorporate those road closure lists with ONS's outgoing neighborhood emails, trying, and again, since we're probably already set for this year, but moving forward as new applicants come in, if it's of a significant size, and I'll leave it to your judgment what qualifies, looping in the relevant civic association and or our district city council offices, and bringing the police department into this discussion about using some common sense discretion on helping folks get in and out of their homes during these events, I think are three things that should be able to happen fairly easily in preparation for the coming spring.
Absolutely.
Great. Are there any other members of the public who wish to speak? Feel free to come down to the microphone at this time.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. My name is Mike George. I'm here at the invitation of the Neighborhood Association of the Back Bay, of which I'm a member. My comments are my own. And with NAB, I head up a group of condominium management group that looks at how we manage the buildings. I also serve as NAB's representative on the Association for Downtown Civic Associations, organizations, ADCO. Just to summarize a couple of things, and as ADCO also transitions from a successful campaign to regulate short-term rentals into the area of transportation, there's some broader transportation issues that are raised by this issue too. While we may be the most affluent neighborhood, the residents of the Back Bay, we're also the most medically needy. And as the congestion in the streets clogs up our neighbors, it at some point impacts the ability for emergency vehicles to get through. I understand the police and fire are at the table during these meetings, but we're increasingly concerned about being able to get access to the great medical facilities that we have, in the city. The second I would say is, and I applaud the idea of getting an economic impact indicator. I'm a retired public administrator, 25 years in state and local government, past president of American Society for Public Administration, Massachusetts chapter, and understand the difficulty in bringing in metrics and fact-based decision-making into the public sector. I have not heard a lot of, while I heard some kind of initial analytical approach to this problem in terms of compiling data and collecting data, I didn't hear a lot more about metrics, about a decision-making process that's readily accessible. So I guess if we have to buy something to give us that information, that's great. So I applaud that we can move towards a more fact-based, particularly since the impression is that the businesses don't particularly benefit from these events. Those would be a couple observations I have. And as usual, NAB is willing and very much welcome the engagement and the participation of the city, and appreciate the understanding on that. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other members of the public interested in speaking now? Any final comments from our panelists? Thank you so much for your time. This will conclude our hearing on docket number 0131, order for a hearing regarding the use of public ways. This hearing is adjourned.